What if ancient Egypt was not a religious state? What if what we now call faith was never the goal, but only an interface? A way to keep something far more practical running beneath the surface. Because whenever Egypt is mentioned, gods immediately appear. The afterlife, rituals, symbols carved into stone. But maybe we are making the same mistake we often make with the modern world, judging it by slogans, images, and surface-level narratives, looking at the decoration instead of the mechanism. Maybe what we are seeing was never the purpose. Maybe it was the tool. And here comes the first uncomfortable question. If Egypt was truly obsessed with religion, why was that belief system so precise, so rigid, and so remarkably unchanged for thousands of years? Most religions evolve. They fracture. They adapt. New interpretations appear. Reforms emerge. Disagreements reshape belief. Egypt did not behave like that. The symbols remained. The roles remained. The rituals remained. That is not how living belief systems usually behave. That is how systems behave. And this is where the image of Egypt as a purely spiritual civilization begins to crack. Because belief can tolerate doubt. A system cannot. For a moment, forget words like gods, mysticism, or the sacred. Just look at behavior. You see a civilization that placed extreme value on order, that viewed chaos as an existential threat, that punished deviation, that repeated the same structures across generations, regardless of individuals. This is not the description of a spiritual journey. It is the description of a controlled environment. The Egyptians had a concept called Ma'at, order, balance, the correct state of the world. But Ma'at was not a feeling. It was not personal belief. It was obligation. When Ma'at was broken, the world did not merely suffer symbolically. It failed. Floods, famine, political collapse, social instability. These were not random events. They were interpreted as consequences, not divine moods, not chance, but errors in the structure of reality. Now consider something strange. If Egypt was a religious state, why was change treated as danger? Why was the ideal world one that did not evolve? Why was preservation valued above transformation? Because change is natural to belief, but destructive to an experiment. I am not saying yet that Egypt was an experiment, only that it behaved like one. Look at the role of the pharaoh. He was not merely a king, not simply a representative of the gods. He was responsible for ensuring that reality itself functioned correctly. That order continued, that the world did not collapse into chaos. When the pharaoh was strong, the world was stable. When he failed, disorder followed. This logic is strange for religion, but it makes perfect sense for a system that requires centralized control. And then there is death, not as tragedy, but as process. Egypt was not a civilization that fled from death. On the contrary, death was mapped, standardized, and carefully controlled. The same procedures, the same steps, the same expected outcome. Mummification was not symbolic. It was technical. Each action had its place, its timing, its reason. Why would an entire civilization invest enormous resources into something with no immediate benefit to the living? If belief alone were sufficient, a story would have been enough. Conviction would have been enough. But Egypt demanded precision, and precision is always suspicious. Perhaps Egypt was not obsessed with the afterlife. Perhaps it was obsessed with continuity, with maintaining order across generations, with keeping the world in the state deemed correct. And this leads us to a question we rarely ask. Not, what did the Egyptians believe, but what had to function for their world to remain stable? Once we ask that question, Egypt stops looking like a temple to the gods. It begins to resemble something else entirely. A society that may have been testing what happens when reality is held tightly in place. If we stop looking at ancient Egypt as a religious state and begin to see it as a carefully maintained model of society, many things that once felt excessive or irrational start to make sense. Architecture, for example. The pyramids are not strange because they are large. Large monuments exist in many civilizations. They are strange because they are precise, aligned to the cardinal directions, built according to strict geometry, repeated with consistency across generations. It is almost as if the identity of the builders mattered less than the correctness of the result. That matters, because symbolic structures can be imperfect. Systemic structures cannot. Any long-term experiment requires constants. Fixed reference points, places and forms that do not change. Egypt was filled with them. Temples, pyramids, sacred complexes, not as decoration, but as anchors. Anchors in space, and perhaps in time as well. Now consider something else. If Egypt was obsessed with the afterlife, why was it so intensely focused on this world? On the land, on the Nile, on cycles, on repetition. Death was not an escape to somewhere else. It was a continuation of order. And this brings us to ritual. A ritual is not a prayer. A ritual is a process. It must be performed correctly, at the correct time, by the correct person, in the correct sequence. This is not spiritual exploration. This is protocol. And when a protocol is broken, a system fails. That is why Egyptian rituals allowed almost no improvisation, why errors were dangerous, why precision mattered more than intention. Egypt did not seek new answers. Egypt sought the same result again and again. Now imagine a society built on the belief that the world functions only when every person performs their role correctly. The farmer, the scribe, the priest, the pharaoh. No individual was important by themselves. What mattered was the function they fulfilled. And this is where Egypt begins to resemble an experiment in human behavior. Not an experiment in the modern laboratory sense, but a civilizational one. What happens when generation after generation grows up inside the same mental framework? When values do not shift, when roles remain fixed, when time is understood as a cycle rather than a line? Perhaps Egypt was not studying gods, perhaps it was studying stability, and perhaps it was studying humans, because humans are the most unstable element of any system. They doubt, they desire change, they disrupt patterns. Egypt attempted to neutralize that instability, not through brute force, but through structure. If people believe that the order of the universe depends on their behavior, they will regulate themselves. If they believe chaos has consequences, they will avoid it. Now return to the pharaoh. The pharaoh was not a god in the modern sense. He was the embodiment of a role, the point where the system converged. If he functioned correctly, the world remained stable. If he failed, disorder spread. This is a dangerous model, but it is also an efficient one, because responsibility was centralized and chaos had a name. Then there is time. Egypt did not pursue the future. It did not pursue progress. It did not celebrate innovation. It pursued continuity. Time was not something to overcome. It was something to preserve, again and again, the same, correctly. This may be the deepest difference between Egypt and the modern world. We see change as proof of life. Egypt saw change as a threat. We believed the world should evolve. Egypt believed the world should be maintained. And that may be why we struggle to understand it. We look through the eyes of a civilization that treats instability as normal. Egypt treated instability as failure. And here we arrive at the most unsettling thought. What if Egypt was not a dead end of history? What if it was a deliberate alternative, not abandoned because it failed, but because it succeeded too well? Stability has a cost. It resists transformation. And transformation is what the modern world is built on. Perhaps we chose chaos because it allows freedom. And perhaps Egypt chose order at the expense of freedom. That choice may be the reason Egypt still fascinates us, because it represents a different answer. Not better, not worse, just different. And that brings us back to the question we began with. What if ancient Egypt was not a religious state, but an experiment? Not an experiment designed to reach a conclusion, but an experiment designed to last. And perhaps it lasted as long as people were willing to play their roles, as long as they believed the order of the world depended on them. And perhaps it ended the moment change itself became more valuable than stability. That is a belief we still live with today. If you found this perspective interesting, consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps this kind of content reach people who might enjoy it.